Hey everyone, 99% of you watching aren't subscribed. Let's change that. Hit that subscribe button, and at 1,000 subscribers, we'll drop special stories just for you.
The sky above the capital burned violet the night princess. Kaylee's chose trees in over-obedience. From a balcony of the eastern tower, she watched the aurora storms coil across the upper atmosphere like luminous serpents. The energy currents were stronger than usual. They pulsed in rhythmic waves that mirrored the tremor beneath her feet, the starwell charging. Far below, the city of Ethrian shimmered in layers of light. Skybridges arced between crystalline spires. Transit lanes flashed with silver streams of aircraft. Citizens walked unaware beneath transparent climate domes, believing the glow in the heavens was merely a seasonal fluctuation. Only the royal family and high council knew the truth. The starwell was no longer charging for warmth. It was preparing to burn. A summons chimed at her wrist. Hall of Ancestors. Immediate attendance. Kaylee's closed her eyes for a single, measured breath. It had begun. The Hall of Ancestors was carved from black stone mined from the planet's core, a material said to absorb light and memory alike. Along its towering walls shimmered holographic effigies of past rulers. Kings and queens who had expanded borders, crush rebellions, forge alliances through diplomacy or annihilation. Their spectral gazes followed her as she entered. The High Council stood arranged in a semicircle before the Starwell conduit, a vertical beam of contained stellar plasma descending from orbit through a lattice of quantum anchors. Within its containment field, compressed starlight churned like a captive sun. At the far end of the chamber, elevated upon the obsidian throne, sat the Empress. Her mother, Empress Violara, did not rise when Kaylee's approached. She did not need to. Authority radiated from her stillness more powerfully than motion ever could. "You kept us waiting," the Empress said. Kaylee's knelt, as tradition demanded. The cold stone pressed through the thin fabric of her ceremonial robes. "I came as swiftly as I was called." A murmur rippled through the counselors, men and women clad in metallic sashes that denoted military rank, economic dominion, scientific oversight. Every sector of the empire was represented. Every sector had voted. The Chancellor stepped forward, his voice amplified by discreet throat implants. "Princess Kaylees, you are aware of the frontier insurrection." "I am aware of the resource disputes," she replied evenly, "and of the trade sanctions that precipitated them." The Chancellor's expression tightened. "The colonies have seized 3 Helios arrays. They threaten our energy supply lines. Their leaders refuse negotiation. They refuse surrender," Kaylee's corrected. The Empress's eyes sharpened. Semantics will not alter reality. A projection ignited above the council floor. It displayed the outer colonies, clusters of domed habitats scattered across bare moons and asteroid stations. Red markers blinked like infected wounds. "Our analysts project a 73% probability of continued escalation," said the Minister of Defense. "Within 2 cycles, they may gain access to shield-piercing weaponry." Kaylee's rose from her kneel. "And so, we preemptively annihilate them?" A thin smile touched the minister's lips. "We demonstrate consequence." The star well flared brighter, as if responding to the word. Kaylee's felt its heat even from across the chamber. The power of a captured star. The legacy of her ancestors' greatest scientific triumph. Originally built to stabilize climate collapse centuries ago. Later modified for defensive contingencies. Now calibrated for planetary sterilization. "You taught me," Kaylee said, her gaze fixed on the Empress, "that the strength of a ruler is measured not by fear they inspire, but by stability they preserve." "Stability," the Empress replied, "requires obedience, not extinction." The words struck the chamber like a physical blow. Several counselors shifted uncomfortably. Others stiffened, affronted. The Chancellor gestured, and the projection shifted. Simulated trajectories appeared, arcs of incandescent energy sweeping across colonial surfaces. Impact models calculated atmospheric ignition, tectonic destabilization, oceanic vaporization. Casualty estimates scrolled in sterile white text. Hundreds of millions. The Minister of Defense spoke calmly. "A single calibrated discharge from the Starwell will eliminate insurgent infrastructure, The outer moons are sparsely populated. Losses aren't acceptable. Kaylee stared at the numbers. Acceptable to whom? Silence answered her. The Empress rose at last. The chamber seemed to contract around her. You have always been idealistic, Violara said, descending the steps of the throne. It is a trait I once admired. Compassion inspires loyalty in times of peace. She stopped a breath away from her daughter. But peace is an illusion maintained by decisive violence. Kaylee's met her mother's gaze and saw not cruelty, but conviction. That frightened her more. If we fire the star well, Kaylee said softly, we teach every remaining colony that dissent equals death. We will not end rebellion. We will guarantee it. The alternative, the Chancellor interjected sharply, is weakness. Kaylee's turned to face the Council. The alternative is negotiation, resource restructuring, representation in central governance. Laughter broke from one of the elder counselors. Representation? You would dilute royal authority to appease minors and smugglers. I would prevent genocide. The word echoed. Genocide. It had not been spoken in this chamber for centuries. The Empress's expression hardened into something impenetrable. Enough. The Star Wars hum deepened, resonating in Kaylee's bones. Princess Kaylee's, the Empress declared, her voice amplified by the hall's acoustic field. You stand in opposition to a unanimous strategic directive of this council. Kaylee's heart skipped. Unanimous. She scanned the semicircle of faces. Not one looked uncertain. The vote had already been cast. This gathering was not deliberation. It was formality. You summoned me, Kaylee said slowly, not to debate, to witness, the Empress corrected. The star well flared again, brighter than before. Through the high aperture in the chamber ceiling, a beam of light shot skyward toward the orbital array, linking ground and heavens in a column of contained starfire. Charging sequence initiated. Kaylee felt the tremor beneath her feet intensify. If you proceed, she said, her voice rising despite herself, I will invoke the royal ethical mandate. A collective intake of breath swept the hall. The mandate was ancient, an override clause embedded into imperial law after a long-forgotten civil war. It allowed a direct heir to call for planetary referendum before any act of mass destruction. The Empress studied her daughter carefully. You would fracture the empire in its most vulnerable hour. I would give our people a voice. The silence that followed was absolute. Then the Chancellor leaned toward the Empress and whispered something too low to hear. Violara's expression did not change, but something final settled behind her eyes. You mistake your position, the Empress said at last. 2 armored guards stepped forward from the chamber's periphery. The royal ethical mandate applies only to recognized heirs. Cold crept through Kaylee's limbs. I am your only heir. The Empress's voice rang out, clear and merciless. You were... The chamber doors sealed with a thunderous boom. A data slate materialized in the Chancellor's hands. He read from it with clinical precision. By decree of the Imperial Throne, Princess Kaylee's Valoran is hereby stripped of title, rank, inheritance, and genetic authority. Her access to all royal systems is revoked. Her name will be expunged from official record. Each word felt like a blade. This action is undertaken in response to sedition and obstruction of sovereign defense protocol. The guards seized her arms. You cannot erase blood, Kaylee said, struggling against their grip. The Empress stepped closer, close enough that only Kaylee's could hear her next words. No, Violara murmured, but we can erase influence. For the first time, something flickered in her mother's gaze. Not doubt, regret. You forced my hand, the Empress said quietly. History will understand. Kaylee straightened despite the guard hold. History, she replied, is written by survivors. By dawn, the archives have been rewritten. Portraits dissolved from public galleries. Educational feeds updated seamlessly. Official lineage charts now displayed a vacant branch where her name once resided. Citizens awoke unaware that their princess had ever existed. By dusk, Kaylee stood in restraints aboard a silent transport at the edge of the planetary shield. No trial, no public announcement, only exile under the classification of internal destabilization threat. Through the viewport, she saw Ethrian one last time, the radiant capital she had loved since childhood. The launch officer avoided her gaze. Coordinates were input manually, not to colony, not to a monitored outpost, but beyond mapped territory, beyond rescue range. The engines ignited. As the craft pierced the shield barrier, turbulence rocked the cabin violently. Atmospheric friction scorched the hull in streaks of flame. Kaylee's closed her eyes. If they intended imprisonment, they would have chosen a cell. If they intended mercy, they would have chosen negotiation. This trajectory offered neither. It offered oblivion. When the engines began to stutter mid-flight, she understood the truth. The transport had never been meant to survive the journey. Her banishment was not exile. It was execution without spectacle. The last thing she saw before impact was her homeworld shrinking behind her, serene, luminous, unaware that its rulers had just cast away the only voice that dared defy a star. Impact did not come as a single moment. It came in fragments. A scream of tearing metal. A violent inversion of sky and ground. A burst of white, so bright it erased thought itself. Then, silence. Kaylee became aware of pain before she became aware of being alive. It radiated from her ribs in sharp, splintering pulses. Her left arm was numb. Her mouth tasted like copper and burnt circuitry. For a long time she did not open her eyes, because opening would confirm she had not died, and dying would have been simpler. A warning tone flickered weakly in her auditory implant. Life support, critical. Core stability, failure. Evacuate immediately. She forced her eyes open. The transport's cockpit had collapsed inward. Transparent alloy fractured into crystalline webs. Beyond it stretched a horizon unlike any landscape she had ever studied. The sky was not the soft gold of Ethrian's filtered atmosphere. It was black, not night black, a vast, unshielded emptiness streaked with slow-moving ribbons of auroral light. Green, violet, pale blue, they rippled across the upper atmosphere like ghostly rivers. The ground beneath her was not snow. It was ash frozen into drifts, powdered mineral and ancient debris locked in ice. The crash had gouged a trench across the plain, scattering burning fragments of the transport in a wide arc. She was alone. The realization settled slowly, like frost forming over glass. No escort vessel hovered overhead. No recovery beacon pulsed. No emergency channel responded to her suit's automated distress signal. She had been sent here to disappear. Another tremor shook the wreckage. The reactor core. She had minutes, perhaps less, before containment failed. Kaylee's tried to move and nearly blacked out. Her side burned as if something jagged shifted inside her. Broken ribs. Possibly worse. She reached for the release latch on her restraints. It responded sluggishly, her royal clearance codes already voided. She ripped the cable from the console and manually triggered the mechanism. The harness snapped open. When she tried to stand, her left leg buckled. She caught herself against the fractured console, breath ragged. "Move," she whispered to herself. The rear hatch had jammed on impact. Emergency lights flickered red along the narrow corridor. Smoke curled along the ceiling. She limped, half dragging her leg, toward the side access port. The hatch's manual override required a full biometric authorization. She pressed her palm against the reader. Access denied. Of course. She swallowed a surge of bitter laughter and pulled the emergency pry bar from the wall. The first strike against the hatch sent shockwaves through her injured ribs. The second nearly dropped her to her knees. On the third, the seal fractured. Freezing air screamed into the cabin. She fell out of the transport and into the ash. The cold hit like a physical entity, a living force that clawed at exposed skin and forced the air from her lungs. Her suit's thermal regulators sparked erratically, compensating as best they could. Behind her, the transport's hull glowed brighter. She staggered away. 10 steps. 15. At 20, the reactor detonated. The explosion was not enormous. Containment had absorbed most of it, but it was enough. A bloom of white fire erupted upward, briefly illuminating the wasteland in stark relief. Jagged rock formations loomed in the distance like the skeletons of titanic creatures. For one fleeting second, the world looked almost beautiful. Then darkness returned, heavier than before. Hours passed. Or perhaps it was less. Time fractured into a cycle of pain and motion. Kaylee's moved because stopping meant freezing. Her suit displayed atmospheric data in thin lines of red text across her vision. Oxygen, 61%. Temperature, -47 standard. Wind velocity, rising. The ash plain stretched endlessly in all directions, broken only by distant ridges of black stone protruding through the ice. There were no visible structures, no energy signatures, no artificial light. If this world had once held life, it had long since surrendered it. Her thoughts drifted to childhood lessons, maps of uninhabited territories, speculative charts of failed terraforming attempts beyond imperial space. There had been whispers of a forgotten mining outpost beyond the shield's farthest calibration range, abandoned decades ago, too unstable to maintain, too costly to rescue. She wondered if that was where she walked now. The wind intensified, whipping ash into spirals that stung like shattered glass against her visor. Microfractures spread along its surface. Her breathing grew shallow. Each step jarred her ribs. Dizziness crept along the edges of her vision. She needed shelter. Ahead, the jagged rock formation she glimpsed earlier rose higher, casting long, blade-like shadows across the plain. They might provide wind cover, perhaps even geothermal vents. She aimed for them. Halfway there, her suit's temperature regulators faltered. A sharp burst of static crackled through her neural interface. Thermal system failure. Partial. Cold seeped in immediately. Not dramatic. No sudden ice, no instant paralysis. Just a steady, merciless infiltration. Her fingers numbed first, then her toes. The ache in her ribs dulled, replaced by a distant pressure that felt strangely manageable. She knew enough survival protocol to recognize the danger. Hypothermia did not feel like violence. It felt like relief. By the time she reached the rocks, her legs trembled uncontrollably. The formations towered overhead. Jagged columns of black basalt fused with metallic veins that shimmered faintly beneath the aurora light. She slipped between two of them into a narrow crevice, shielded from the wind. The air here was marginally calmer. She sank to her knees. Her suit registered dangerously low power reserves. Without a functioning thermal regulator, it would shut down within the hour. She tried to activate her emergency beacon again. No signal. The planetary interference was too strong, or deliberately shielded. She leaned back against a stone and looked up at the sky. It felt impossibly vast without the glow of orbital traffic or atmospheric filtering. Stars burned with sharpness she had never seen before, unsoftened by civilization. For the first time since childhood, she saw the universe as something indifferent, not an empire, not territory, just space. Her mother's words echoed in her mind. Peace is an illusion maintained by decisive violence. Was she naive? Had she misjudged the cost of restraint? If the colonies truly intended escalation, perhaps she cut the thought off. No, annihilation was not stability. It was fear disguised as order. Her breathing slowed. The numbness spread further, up her arms, across her shoulders. She was so tired, it would be easy to close her eyes, to let the cold finish what the council had begun. Perhaps that was always the intended conclusion. A princess erased without spectacle, a dissenting voice swallowed by the dark. Her chin dipped toward her chest. The wind outside howled like distant machinery. Then, a vibration, faint, so faint she thought at first it was memory. She lifted her head. There was again a rhythmic tremor beneath the ice. Not natural, too mechanical. Her suit's failing sensors flickered, struggling to interpret the disturbance. Static overwhelmed most readings, but a tiny fluctuation appeared along the lower edge of her display. Heat signature. Mobile. Approaching. Her heart gave a weak, startled beat. Impossible. No one inhabited this wasteland. No rescue had been dispatched. The vibration grew stronger. A low metallic cadence, like articulated limbs striking frozen ground. Step, step, step. She tried to rise, but her legs would not respond. Her body had entered protective shutdown. The crevice darkened as something large passed between her and the aurora light. A shadow fell over her. Through blurred vision, she glimpsed towering mechanical legs. Steel struts reinforced with scavenged plating, joints emitting faint puffs of vapor with each movement. A walker, not imperial design. Crude, functional, modified repeatedly. It halted. Silence followed, thick and assessing. A panel hissed open somewhere above. Footsteps descended the rock face carefully. Human footsteps. Kaylee's forced her eyes upward. A figure approached through the dim light, silhouetted against the aurora glow. Heavy insulated gear. Helmet visor reflecting fractured green light. A scanner device held loosely in one gloved hand. The figure stopped a few paces away. For a long moment, neither moved. If this was a scavenger, she was valuable salvage. If this was something worse. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. The figure knelt. A beam of white light swept across her suit, pausing at the torn insignia near her collar where the royal crest had once been embedded. The beam lingered there, then shifted to her face. She felt the cold receding further, consciousness thinning at the edges. The last thing she saw before darkness overtook her was a stranger removing his helmet. Not an executioner, not a soldier, just a man staring at her with something like reluctant disbelief. Then everything went black. He had learned long ago that hesitation was how you died out here. The wasteland rewarded speed, calculation, and emotional distance. Salvage what you could. Avoid what you couldn't. Never investigate anomalies that didn't promise fuel, circuitry, or tradable alloy. Heat signatures were rarely worth the risk. Most were unstable reactors. Some were bait, automated distress lures left behind by raiders who no longer roamed, but whose traps still functioned perfectly. And sometimes they were bodies. Bodies meant questions. Questions meant complications. He should have walked away. The scanner in his glove flickered with interference as he crouched before the half-buried figure in the crevice. The suit she wore was scorched and cracked, but the material quality was unmistakable. Layered synth silk interwoven with adaptive mesh. Not frontier issue. Not scavenger make. Central world fabrication. He adjusted the beam, illuminating her face. Young. Frost clung to her lashes. A thin line of dried blood traced from her temple to her jaw. Even in near unconsciousness, there was something composed in her features. Something disciplined. Not the look of a drifter. Not the look of someone accustomed to hunger. He shifted the scanner toward her collar. The insignia had been forcibly removed, leaving only a faint geometric scar in the fabric where embedded circuitry once lay. Intentional. Erasure. He swore under his breath. Of all the wreckage in all the wastelands, he muttered. The wind howled across the basalt formations, rattling the walker's upper struts. His machine loomed above them, 3 stories tall, assembled from mining rig limbs and stripped carrier plating. It was ugly, uneven, and louder than he liked. But it moved, and it was his. He tapped the scanner again. Vitals, weak. Core temperature, dropping fast. Rib fractures likely. Internal bleeding possible. Time window for survival, short. He should leave her. Royal fabric meant Imperial involvement. Imperial involvement meant patrol sweeps. Patrol sweeps meant questions about unauthorized habitation beyond shield parameters. He did not survive this long by inviting attention. She stirred faintly. Her lips moved. They will burn the colonies. The words were barely audible over the wind. He leaned closer despite himself. The Starwell, she whispered. You must. Her voice dissolved into a shuddering breath. The Starwell. He froze. Even out here, even beyond official broadcast range, fragments of news filtered through. Broken transmissions carried by solar wind. Snatches of encrypted military chatter he occasionally intercepted while scavenging decommissioned satellites. Energy surges in orbit. Unusual charge patterns. Whispers of escalation. The Starwell was not rumor. It was real, and if it was charging at full capacity, the sky itself could become a weapon. He looked back toward the horizon where the faint glow of her crashed transport still smoldered. That had not been an accident. He could read wreckage patterns. The engine core had failed mid-atmosphere. Too cleanly, too conveniently. Someone had meant for her not to arrive anywhere alive. He exhaled slowly, fog blooming inside his visor. Damn it! He slid one arm beneath her shoulders and another under her knees. She weighed less than he expected, fragile beneath the reinforced suit. She did not wake as he carried her toward the walker. The machine's hatch lowered with a hydraulic hiss, creating a narrow ramp. Warm air spilled outward, meeting the frozen wind in a swirl of vapor. Inside, the cockpit was cramped but functional. Patchwork metal walls lined with cables, salvage consoles glowing amber, storage crates secured against the sides. The air smelled faintly of oil and recycled oxygen. He laid her on the central bench and sealed the hatch. The outside world vanished into muted silence. He removed her damaged outer suit carefully, cutting away fused sections with thermal blade. Beneath it, her inner garment bore microfilament circuitry, adaptive armor woven thin as cloth. Definitely central world. Definitely not a minor. Bruising spread dark along her left side. The scanner confirmed 2 cracked ribs, one possibly displaced. No spinal damage. Internal bleeding minimal but present. Lucky, or stubborn. He activated the walker's medkit, an old field unit from a dismantled carrier frigate. Its interface glitched twice before stabilizing. Synfoam applicators deployed, sealing microfractures along her ribs with expanding polymer lattice. A thermal blanket descended automatically, wrapping her in controlled heat. Her pulse steadied incrementally. He removed his gloves and flexed his fingers, watching her face. Up close, the signs were clearer. Fine dermal implants along her temple, royal-grade neural augmentation. The faint shimmer beneath her skin indicated embedded identification nanites. He leaned back. "Who are you?" he asked quietly, though he already suspected. She had mentioned the Starwell not as rumor, but as warning. Only someone close to its command structure would speak that way. He turned toward the main console and accessed his long-range receiver. Static filled the cabin, then fragmented signals resolved into faint patterns. Orbital frequencies were busy tonight. Too busy. He isolated one burst and amplified it. Charge progression at 72%. Authorization confirmed by Throne Council. Target coordinates locked. He killed the feed. 72%. If the Starwell discharged at full capacity, the outer colonies would not simply be disciplined. They would be erased. He looked back at her. "Your trouble," he murmured. Her eyelids fluttered. Slowly, she drew in a deeper breath. When her eyes opened, they were not unfocused with confusion. They were assessing, alert even through pain. "Where?" Her voice cracked. She swallowed. "Where am I?" "In my walker," he replied. Her gaze shifted around the cabin, cataloging exits, tools, distances. Not panicked. Trained. "You're not Imperial," she said. "No." She tried to push herself upright and winced sharply. "Don't," he said. "You'll reopen the fractures." She ignored him, managing to sit with visible effort. The thermal blanket slipped from her shoulders. "You found my transport." It found the ground first. A flicker of grim humor touched her expression, then vanished. "Why did you bring me here?" He shrugged lightly. "You were alive." Her eyes narrowed slightly, as if evaluating whether that answer concealed more. It didn't. Not entirely. She glanced toward the console where orbital trajectories still glowed faintly. "You're monitoring them," she said. "Yes." "They're preparing to fire." "I gathered that." Her jaw tightened. "They believe the colonies are destabilizing the Empire. They think decisive destruction will prevent long-term rebellion. You disagree." "I invoked the royal ethical mandate." He stilled. "You're royal." "I was..." She held his gaze without flinching. "They stripped my title before launching me beyond the shield." "Convenient," he said dryly. "They intended for the crash to finish what the decree began." Silence settled between them. He studied her more openly now. "You're the heir." "I was," she repeated. "And you oppose him publicly." "Yes." He let out a low whistle. "That's not defiance," he said. "That's suicide." A flicker of something sharp passed through her expression. "If silence preserves power through massacre," she said quietly, "then defiance is survival." He considered that. "You understand what happens if you go back," he said. "They won't hesitate a second time. I don't intend to ask for mercy." The conviction in her voice was not loud. It was steady. He turned back to the console, pulling up a magnified projection of the planet above. Orbital arrays shimmered like delicate rings of light. At the center, the Starwell pulsed, brighter than any other signature. "It's at 72% charge," he said. "When it hits full capacity, the discharge window will be narrow." "There's a failsafe," she said immediately. He glanced at her. "Of course there is." It was installed after the first expansion war. A manual override within the Starwell core. It requires direct genetic authentication from the ruling bloodline. "And you still qualify?" "They erased my title," she said. "Not my DNA." He leaned back in his seat. "That means boarding an orbital array defended by the entire Imperial fleet." "Yes." "Penetrating the core chamber." "Yes." "Triggering an override that will mark your genetic signature across every military console in existence." "Yes." He stared at her. "You're asking me to help you commit treason against the most powerful government in this quadrant." She did not look away. "I'm asking you to help me prevent genocide." The word hung in the cabin, heavy and unadorned. Outside, the auroras shifted, casting faint green light through the narrow viewport. He had built his life on avoidance, on staying small, on surviving between the cracks of empires. Involvement meant risk. Risk meant death. But so did inaction. If the Starwell fired, shock waves would ripple far beyond the colonies. Trade routes would collapse. Retaliations would follow. War would spread outward like fracture lines in glass. Even the wasteland would not remain untouched forever. He powered down the external scanners and sat in silence for a long moment. Then he stood. "There's a launch craft buried beneath the northern ridge," he said. "Old mining shuttle. I've been restoring it for orbital salvage runs." Her expression shifted, hope restrained by caution. "It can reach the array?" "If we push it hard enough." She exhaled slowly. "You don't even know my name." He paused near the hatch controls. "Does it matter?" "It might." He turned slightly. "Fine," he said. "What is it?" She straightened despite the pain. "Kaylee's." He nodded once. "Rest, Kaylee's. We leave at first light." "And you?" she asked. He hesitated only a fraction of a second. "Call me Aaron." Not his full name, but enough. She lay back against the bench, exhaustion reclaiming her. As her eyes closed again, Aaron looked up at the distant planet glowing in the viewport. The Starwell's pulse intensified. 75%. He had survived years by refusing to choose sides. Tonight, beneath alien stars, he had chosen one, and there would be no returning to obscurity after this. The launch craft had not been built for heroics. It had been built for hauling ore. Its hull bore the scars of micrometeor strikes and decades of neglect. Weld lines crisscrossed its surface where Aaron had patched fractures with scavenged plating. The cockpit smelled faintly of ionized fuel and old metal. But when its engines ignited beneath the northern ridge, they roared with defiant life. Kaylee's gripped the edge of her seat as the craft tore upward through the wasteland's thin atmosphere. Pain radiated through her ribs with every vibration, but she refused the stabilizing sedatives Aaron had offered. "I need a clear head," she had said. Now the black skies swallowed them whole. Below, the frozen ash world diminished into a pale, scarred sphere. Above, her home world loomed larger with every passing second, blue oceans swirling beneath bands of cloud, orbital arrays glittering like delicate crowns of light. At the center of those arrays pulsed the Starwell, brighter than she had ever seen it. "How long?" she asked. Aaron's hands moved rapidly over the patched console, rerouting power from non-essential systems to engine thrust. "Charge is at 89%, he said. "We intercept the outer maintenance ring in 6 minutes, assuming they don't detect us." "They'll detect us," Kaylee's replied calmly. He glanced at her. "You sound certain." "They expect threats from outside forces, not from what they believe is dead." He huffed softly. Let's hope they're arrogant. As if summoned by the word, the console emitted a sharp alert tone. Unidentified vessel. Transmit authorization. Imperial encryption flooded the screen. Aaron muted the audio channel. Here we go. 2 interceptor drones detached from the outer ring, angling toward them with mechanical precision. Kaylee's leaned forward despite the pain. Cut primary thrusters. Divert to lateral drift. That'll slow us. It will make us look like debris. Aaron executed the maneuver. The craft shuddered as forward thrust dropped and side stabilizers flared weakly. On the tactical display, their trajectory shifted into a tumbling arc toward the maintenance sector. The interceptors paused. Scanning. Seconds stretched thin. Kaylee's could almost feel the Star Wars energy through the hull, a pressure in her bones like a storm waiting to break. One interceptor broke formation and veered away. The second lingered, sweeping a scanning beam across their hull. Aaron held his breath. The beam passed. The interceptor rejoined its counterpart. They bought it, he muttered. For now, Kaylee said. They docked against a maintenance ring with a jolt that reverberated through the craft's frame. The external hatch hissed open. Cold, recycled air from the orbital array flooded in. The maintenance corridor beyond was dimly lit, designed for drones and technicians, not intruders. Metal walls curved in seamless arcs, embedded with conduits carrying raw stellar energy toward the core. Kaylee stepped out first. Her legs wavered, but she steadied herself against the wall. You're in no condition to lead, Aaron said quietly. I'm the only one who can end this. He didn't argue again. They moved quickly. Kaylee's navigated by memory, childhood visits during ceremonial inspections, lessons in energy governance she had once found tedious. She had never imagined those corridors would become a battlefield. The deeper they went, the louder the hum became. Not sound, exactly. Resonance. The Star Wars power vibrated through the structure, turning the air electric. A security gate sealed the final passage before the core chamber. Aaron stepped forward, examining the lock. Genetic clearance required, he said. That's expected. She pressed her palm against the illuminated panel. For one terrifying moment, nothing happened. Then, genetic match confirmed. Royal lineage, verified. Access granted. The gate slid open. Aaron exhaled slowly. So much for erasing you. They erased my name, Kaylee said. Not my existence. The core chamber was vast. A cathedral built around a captive sun. At its center, suspended within concentric containment rings, the star well churned, a sphere of compressed stellar plasma, swirling in violent gold and white currents. Energy arced along the chamber walls, feeding upward through conduits toward the orbital focusing array. Charge level, 96%. The heat was immense, even through shielding. On the far side of the chamber stood a raised control dais, and upon it, the Empress. Violara stood flanked by 2 members of the High Council and a detachment of royal guards. Her gaze lifted the instant Kaylee's entered. For a heartbeat, mother and daughter simply stared at one another across the blazing chamber. I wondered, the Empress said at last, her voice amplified by the chamber's acoustics, whether the wasteland would finish what we began. It tried, Kaylee's replied. The guards raised their weapons. Aaron stepped slightly in front of her, but Kaylee's placed a hand on his arm. Wait. The star well flared brighter. 98%. You should not be here, Violara said. There was no surprise in her tone, only inevitability. The vote was cast. The colonies chose defiance. They chose survival, Kaylee shot back. As I am choosing now. The Chancellor stepped forward. You're no longer authorized to interfere. Kaylee's moved toward the dais. Authorization is written into my blood. The guards advanced. Aaron drew a compact pulse cutter from his belt. Last chance, he muttered. But before conflict erupted, the chamber trembled. Charge capacity, 99%. Discharge imminent. Violara's composure faltered. For the first time. You would risk civil fracture for traitors? She demanded. I would risk everything, Kaylee said, voice steady despite the inferno behind her, to prevent us from becoming what we fear. The final percentage ticked upward. 100. Energy screamed through the conduits, coiling into the focusing array above. Kaylee's ran. Guards lunged, but Aaron intercepted one with a blast from the cutter, sending the man crashing backward. Chaos erupted across the dais. Kaylee's reached the central console and slammed her palm against the biometric interface. The system resisted. Primary discharge sequence locked by Throne Authority. She pressed her other hand against the secondary panel. The failsafe her tutors had once described as ceremonial redundancy. "Come on," she whispered. Behind her, weapons discharged. Sparks rained across the chamber. Violara shouted something she couldn't hear. The Star Wars light intensified to blinding white. Then, royal ethical mandate. Genetic override initiated. Manual failsafe engaged. Discharge sequence aborted. The chamber convulses, energy pathways rerouted inward instead of outward. Instead of firing toward the colonies, the star well collapsed its charge into internal containment. A shockwave rippled harmlessly through the orbital array. The light dimmed. The hum softened. Silence fell like a dropped curtain. No beam lands toward distant worlds. No planets burned. Kaylee sagged against the console, breath ragged. Across the chamber, the guards had lowered their weapons. The High Council members stared at the cooling star well in stunned disbelief. Violara stood motionless. "It is done," Kaylee said quietly. The Empress descended from the dais, slowly. "You have humiliated this council," she said. "I have preserved it," Kaylee's replied, "by undermining sovereign authority, by reminding it of its purpose." For a long moment, neither moved. Then Vylara's gaze shifted, not to her daughter, but to the chamber's observation screens. Across the Empire, citizens were witnessing the aborted discharge. Military feeds had captured everything. The override message bearing Kaylee's genetic signature, the mandate, the restraint. Whispers would spread. Questions would rise. The illusion of unanimous violence had fractured. Violara looked back at her daughter. "You have forced change," the Empress said quietly. "Yes, and change invites instability." "Then we will guide it," Kaylee's answered. A long silence followed. Finally, Violara turned to the council. "Stand down," she commanded. The guards lowered their weapons fully. Aaron stepped to Kaylee's side. She glanced at him. "You could still leave," she said softly, "and go back to pretending the sky isn't weaponized." He shook his head. "I think I've crossed that line." The starwell glowed now with steady, controlled light, no longer a blade poised above distant throats. Kaylee straightened despite the ache in her ribs. She was still banished, still erased from official record, but her blood had spoken louder than decree. The fire meant to destroy had been forced to yield. And somewhere beyond the shield, colonies that would have burned beneath artificial sunfire continued to breathe. A princess cast into the wasteland. A stranger who chose not to walk away. An empire confronted by its own reflection. The future would not be simple. It would not be peaceful overnight, but would not be written in ash. And the fire that had nearly consumed worlds had refused to die as a weapon. Instead, it had become a warning.